The Table with Chris Bell, brought to you on AI Radio with former member of Congress and statesman Chris Bell.
Hi, I'm Chris Bell. Thank you for joining me here at the table so that we can continue our conversation. And if you'd like to weigh in with comments or questions, write to me at chrisbellquestions@gmail.com. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about journalism. Journalism has been an important part of my life, I guess, since the very beginning. I got my degree in journalism at the University of Texas at Austin, and at a time when a lot of friends were getting their degrees and going into the oil business or banking or real estate. So a lot of people ask, why did you choose journalism? Well, growing up in my home during the 60s, journalism was a staple of our being. At 5:30, we would always watch the network news. And there was always a newspaper in our home. And growing up in Dallas, there were actually two very good newspapers in the city, the Dallas Times-Herald and the Dallas Morning News. And my mom had worked at the latter. She was the editor of the Society and homepage, and she always loved journalism and would talk about it a great deal. And I think that was certainly part of my motivation toward that career. But the other part was that it just seemed so damn important growing up. And it was, because back in the day, we only had 3 networks. We didn't have cable television. So what was on ABC or CBS or NBC, that was what everybody was going to be watching pretty much at the same time. And what that created really was a national town hall, because regardless of which network you were watching, you were getting pretty much the same information. Would it be presented a little different by a different reporter, maybe a little different spin? Sure. But as far as the basic content of what was being reported, that was pretty much the same on all 3 networks. And what that allowed was for everyone to receive the same content and then process it however they wanted. Not everybody was going to have the same reaction to the same story, but they would be responding and reacting to the same information. When the internet came along years later, a lot of us were so excited because it was going to provide so much greater access to information. And boy, has it succeeded in that way. But we also thought that that would be really great for folks looking for journalistic content, because there would be so much more. But what we found was that it had created this new opportunity for folks to find a news source that agreed with them. Not one that was necessarily going to give them all the information, but was going to share information in a way that they wanted to hear. But the problem with that is that the information being shared is not always true. And so instead of having a national town hall where we're all discussing the same content, someone may be discussing content that you've never heard of because it's just on one source and it's not necessarily true. And I think we're going to have to get away from that. We're going to have to start relying on sources of news that still take things like objectivity and truthfulness very, very seriously. That's how I was raised, and that's how I was trained when I was going to journalism school. But right now, I think we find ourselves at a very frightening time, because one of the pillars that this country has stood on is a free press and a reliable press and news and information that people can rely on. When I graduated from college, my first job in journalism was in Ardmore, Oklahoma. I was hired as a cameraman and a sometimes sports reporter. And I would lug this big old camera around, and it was about I think altogether 50 pounds of equipment that we would have to haul in order to videotape a story back then. And I worked there in Ardmore for about 6 or 7 months. It was a great experience. And then I was hired by a station in Amarillo, Texas, as a news reporter and eventually the weekend anchor and then the noon anchor. And I covered primarily politics. And I loved the job, but I also realized the power and the responsibility that came with it. You were reporting things that could highly impact somebody's life. And if you were going to put it on television, it had to be accurate. It had to be correct. And sometimes you had to make judgment calls as to whether something really belonged on the air. Wasn't always easy, but I was trained in a way to take the truth extremely seriously and to try to present a story in an unbiased fashion. And that's very difficult because we all have personal beliefs that impact the way we act and think. But the effort has to be made because if you're coming in with a biased opinion in the beginning, obviously it's going to impact the way you present the story. And that's not the purpose of journalism. Journalism, whether it's print or broadcast, the purpose is and should always be to share information, truthful information. But if you see a story, if something pops up on your phone, something pops up on your laptop, and you find it really interesting, well, it may be interesting because it's all made up. It's not true. And if you want to check it, go on the internet, do a search and see if you can find the same or similar type story from any other source, from any other publication. And chances are, if nobody else in the world has written about the same topic, maybe somebody made that up. There are liberal news sources that are full of bunk, and there are right-wing news sources that simply share false information. So check them. Make sure that you're getting truthful information. And that's what you're relying on to shape your opinions. And I think if we do that, we can take steps toward narrowing the divide. There's still going to be differences of opinion. There always will be, and there should be. But at least we'll be talking about the truth and not just some fantasy world that someone has created. If you want to weigh in, write to chrisbellquestions@gmail.com. And I'll look forward to continuing this conversation with other topics next time.